Science has to be testable. A test of a theory has to predict the phenomenon. Falsifiable, theoretical ability to prove it wrong, and empirical evidence, anything that can be observed or measured is amenable to scientific investigations. Explanations that cannot be based on empirical evidence are not part of science. I agree with all of this. Theory of evolution cannot be based on empirical evidence. Examples of the testability in microbiology. I have an undergraduate degree in that. You have a theory where Staph aureus causes a skin boil. You inoculate staph underneath the skin versus saline, a control, and you observe the empirical evidence that the boil is caused by the staph only. Not testable. Now, things that aren't testable can be true, like historical facts. The life of Julius Caesar, the fact that you ate a pizza last week is true, but you can't do a test to get empirical evidence about it. So these beliefs are based on human documentation, memory, and you can't gain empirical evidence for it. You just have to trust the people that what they said is true. But it's not science. Falsifiability. Things that can be tested and potentially could be proven wrong, such as the law of gravity, states that objects of different mass fall at the same rate. Now, that could be falsifiable if you show objects of a different mass fall at different rates. Not science. Potentially could not prove wrong. Now, if the law of gravity stated that objects of different mass fall at the same or different rate, then no matter what the outcome, your theory is supported. So this is testable, but you can't potentially prove it wrong. This is not a science. You have to be able to have an outcome, a potential outcome that can be shown wrong to have it as a viable science. Evolution is not science. There's no empirical evidence. It can't be tested or falsified since it takes billions of years. It can't be inferred from observations. Evolution arguments claiming it's science are universally distorted because the part of descent with modification is ignored. I didn't define evolution. This is the National Academy of Science, National Science Foundation's definition of evolution. The falsifiability has been distorted. Famous biologist in the 1940s said evolution would be falsifiable if you find a skeleton of a modern rabbit instead of an ancestral rabbit from the Precambrian era, which is over 1 billion years ago. Now, the distortion is evolution is presented as simply the existence of different species at different times. The descent with modification is ignored. Recall, evolution claims that the ancestral rabbit or fossil rabbit modified into the modern rabbit. Descent with modification is the definition of evolution. So a true falsification would be if the descendants of an ancestral rabbit did not modify into the modern rabbit. You can't falsify it because you can't follow descendants over billions of years. The testability of evolution is distorted. Nick Matsky, who collaborated with me on my book, biologist at Berkeley, he says you can test a theory by looking for outcomes that it predicts. Evolution predicts the fossil record and transitional species. Again, descent with modification is ignored in the outcomes. It's only asserted. Analogously, you could say aliens predicting periodically mating with earthlings also can predict the fossil record and transitional species. But in both cases, neither aliens nor descent with modification is witnessed. So a true test would be you follow the descendants of the fossil record modifying into transitional species. And you can't test this because it allegedly occurred over billions of years. I'm going to try to drive home this testability, clarification. Karl Popper, famous scientific philosopher, confirming evidence should not count except when it is a genuine result of a test of the theory. So a true test would be you can test a theory by looking for outcomes that it predicts and causes, or at least has a strong association with. Looking for outcomes alone, such as the fossil record or pseudogenes or DNA, is not a test, since evolution is about how the outcome got there. Again, descent with modification, which is a definition of evolution, is ignored in these tests. This commits the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent, where an outcome is shown but no relation to the theory or intervention is established. I named my book Evolution by Affirming the Consequent because after reading authors' conclusions to their scientific papers, this is the #1 fallacy that is committed in evolution literature. To drive home the point, in conventional sciences, such as in medicine, you have a prior state, such as a high cholesterol population with high cholesterol. You have an intervention, such as taking a statin drug, and you measure an outcome, such as low cholesterol, all empiric evidence. Evolution, by contrast, you have an ancestral primate. It allegedly undergoes descent with modification, and you have an outcome of man and chimp. The difference is, in conventional sciences, you see or measure the cholesterol, the prior state. You see or measure the low cholesterol. And the intervention, taking the pill, you see or measure. By contrast, evolution, you see the ancient primate, you see the man and chimp, but the descent with modification is nowhere to be found. So saying evolution, the difference between evolution and conventional tests, it's like saying you're testing a drug, you think a drug causes a low cholesterol, but no one ever sees the drug being given. But evolution predicts many outcomes, therefore it has to be true. The number of positive outcomes, quote unquote, is not enough to support a theory. You must show the outcome is caused by or at least strongly associated with the theory. The evolution intervention, descent with modification, is never shown. So there's not even an association attempted. By contrast, the geocentric universe theory, where it was believed that the sun revolved around the earth, also predicts sun locations. The ancient Greeks devised mathematical formulas where they could predict where the sun would be based on the theory that the sun revolved around the earth. They were able to predict many outcomes, but they were wrong. There was a theory called preformation, in which the early fetus was thought to look like a fully developed adult. And with that theory, you would predict when the creature is born, it would be fully developed. And in fact, that's what happens. Also, the theory of spontaneous generation. You leave meat out for a few weeks, maggots will grow. It was believed that the maggots just spontaneously came from nowhere, when we later found out it was just flies dropping their eggs on there. That you can have multiple outcomes that it would be predicted. You leave out several pieces of meat, and all of them will grow maggots. Those are outcomes that support your theory. So a theory can predict many outcomes and be wrong. Inference. Dawkins, in his book, I shall show the irrefragable power of inference that evolution is fact. So inductive inference is reasoning from specific examples, circumstantial evidence, to a general principle. And in evolution, the examples that they infer from, they show the fossil record in DNA, and from that, they falsely infer what they think is a logical conclusion of evolution. The problem is, to infer something, the inference has to be supported by examples of empiric evidence. So you observe, this example is in all the logic textbooks on secular campuses. The classic example they give is if you observe 2 white swans, you can infer all swans are white. But if you see 400 white swans, then the inference that all swans are white is even greater supported. If you don't see any white swans, then there's no basis for your inference that swans are white. Trends can sometimes be inferred. If you have a graph of vapor pressure versus temperature, and you see a trend, sometimes you can infer what's going to happen with the greater temperature, sometimes you can't. Inference requires examples, and the more analogous the example, the stronger the inference. In my field, occasionally you get infections. And you can infer, and this is common practice, this is standard medical practice, that after an infection, after orthopedic surgery, Staphylococcus aureus is the most common organism. So doctors, when we see a red wound, we automatically give an anti-staph antibiotic, even without doing any testing. Now, there's no test of it. Now, we may not have done the test, but other doctors who published journal articles prior to us did do tests, and they said, and they showed that there's a high chance that staph is the most common infecting organism. So we may not have done the direct observation, but other people did, and this is an analogous situation. Now, conversely, our inference that a orthopedic infection is due to staph is not due to papers that, that show what the organism is in sexually transmitted disease. It is not an analogous example. Evolutionists have different ways of phrasing inference, inference. Regarding the origin of species, they say, what else could it be? And it's the simplest explanation. Analogously, you could say, what's the simplest explanation for the cause of death of a raccoon on the street? Again, inferred or simple answers are based on prior examples from human experience. You may not have seen that particular raccoon hit by a car, but you know from your own experience or experience of others have told you that that's the most likely answer, even though you didn't see it. Now, Bernie talks about how he has these outcomes and he makes the inference of evolution as the most likely cause. But again, to make an inference, it has to be supported by prior examples. Maybe not what you saw, but what other people saw. There has to be empiric evidence somewhere. The distortion of inference is that there's many examples of evolution, such as fossils and DNA similarity. Therefore, evolution must be true. Now, the distortion is that the purported examples aren't real. There's a little circular reasoning. They say the fossils and DNA are evolution examples because they were derived by evolution. There has to be, the fossil and DNA similarity was not seen to be caused by descent with modification from a common ancestor. Again, that's not my definition of evolution. That is the National Science Foundation definition. And Bernie agrees with that definition. So the other distortion is that it is claimed that microevolution, although we all, and I agree that microevolution occurs, that you can infer with time, over 1 billion years, you can get macroevolution. Now, the distortion is that these are not analogous examples, and there's no trend. Micro and macroevolution are qualitatively different. Microevolution has no increase in complexity and no development of physiologic reproductive isolation. Macroevolution, you do have an increase in complexity, and there is physiologic reproductive isolation. Microevolution is not a small increased number of parts. It is no increased number of parts. What would be a real example of inference? A real example, if you've documented the descendants of one species become 10 other species which have increased complexity and physiologic reproductive isolation, then you could probably infer evolution for all species. That would be real inference, but no one has documented that. There are no examples upon which to infer evolution.